I would like to welcome you to the Oregon-California Trails podcast debut. My name is Charlie Dodge. For the past year or so, I have been OCTA's intern, and this podcast has been a bit of a passion project for me, which is why I'm so excited to bring you this, our first episode. My main goal with this podcast has always been to highlight and dive into the parts of Overland Trails history that are not widely taught or discussed. To be more specific, I want to find the stories of marginalized identities along the trails, people of color, Chinese Americans during the gold rush, Black immigrants traveling to Oregon and California, LGBT history along the trails, and the Indigenous American perspective that is all too often left out. All of these subjects and more. I think that this period of American history is much richer and more diverse than the average person might think. So that begs the question, if there's such an untapped, rich, diverse, and complex history here, why don't we know more about it? Why don't we hear more about it? And in my opinion, it all comes down to storytelling. After all, what is history if not a form of storytelling? It's not enough to just state facts and numbers. The best historians are true storytellers who can weave their research into a narrative. Of course, if history is storytelling, then that means how we understand it depends on who is telling the story and how they're telling it. That's how we run into these issues of whitewashed history being taught in schools, where certain groups of people have been left out of the narrative. Personally, I'm hopeful that things are changing, ever so slowly. The way we understand American history has always been evolving, and recently we've been seeing a lot more unconventional narratives being shared, even in mainstream media. This brings me to our podcast's first guest speaker, Bob Clark, who I've invited to have a discussion about storytelling in historical journals and research, and how he made a career for himself in publication. Bob Clark is the editor of OCTA's Overland Journal. For those who might be new to the Oregon-California Trails Association, the Overland Journal is OCTA's quarterly journal of scholarly research into the immigrant experience and our 19th century historic trails. In addition to research articles, the journal regularly includes book reviews, letters to the editor, and a page of diary quotes from original trail diaries. The journal began publication in 1983, and with OCTA membership, you can access 30-plus years of Overland Journal content on our website.
I got involved in overland travel and Western history in general through my career, which was to work in a family publishing company that my grandfather had founded back in 1902. And my father assumed control of it in the 50s. And then I came to work in the 70s. And we specialized in publishing books on the American West, mostly nonfiction. Well, I'll say all nonfiction, but documentary material and scholarly material. And so, of course, a part of the history of the West is the overland migration that took place in the 19th century. And we did lots of other books on fur trade and military material and Native American history. But part of what we did, of course, was documentary on travel over the Overland Trails. And when OCTA was founded about 40 years ago, one of the guys who founded the organization was Greg Francois. And Greg gave me a call when he was putting this organization together and said, "Wouldn't you like to join it? I think it would be of value to you and to all of your customers in the publishing business." And it was. And I joined at that time. So I'm one of the initial members. And I was just kind of a lurker for the first few years. I went to some conferences, but didn't really get too involved in things. We were publishing a series of books at that time called Covered Wagon Women. And so I promoted that series heavily to the membership. It contained diaries and letters from women who'd traveled over the trail. And I knew that membership would be interested in that, and they were. And so that provided a strong connection. And then after about, 10 or 11 years, Greg Francois asked me if I'd be interested in signing up to edit the journal. And that sounded like a good fit for me. And I did apply and was given the job. I did that for a few years and then turned it over to another editor for a period of time, came back on, edited it for another 6 years, and then turned it over again. And then the job came up a couple of 3 years ago again, and I was recently retired from Washington State University Press and thought, here's something I could do in my retirement. So I applied again and they took me on. So here I am editing the journal one more time and really enjoying it. It's just been a wonderful career. I was able to find something that I enjoyed and was able to pursue and met lots of really neat people as a result. So it's all been about relationship and digging back into our past and celebrating it.
Do you have any personal connections to the Overland Trails?
Yes, I do. Although they're not from the publishing company, my grandfather who founded that company had emigrated from England in the 1880s and moved to Chicago. But on my mother's side, she came from a Mormon family, and her forebears had come over the Mormon Trail to Salt Lake City. So there's a connection there. Although I wasn't very much aware of that until later years in my publishing career.
I feel like you deal a lot with, it's not fiction, but you deal with storytelling because, how are we sharing this history and how are we going to portray these different perspectives? What are some stories that have stuck with you as you've worked on the OJ?
Well, of course, women's history was a big part of my exposure to the trails in general. And that was a field that was severely neglected. And it was great that series came out, and then lots of other books came out in the years that followed that covered women's experience on the trail and on the frontier and what their perspective was. And it was different. And it was great to see. Now, since then, I would say that the people who belong to OCTA and who love the trails are principally white descendants of the Protestants who came overland. There hasn't been a whole lot of ethnic study or studies of class, gender, yes, with women, but a lot of that's been neglected because there were so few immigrants of color, say, depressed classes that were struggling, who came overland. You needed money, number one, to have wagons and the oxen and the horses and all the supplies to get all the way across the continent. It took some pretty strong financial backing to get that done. Another interesting area that has been studied now quite a bit, and there's lots more to do on that, is children on the trail. And that's been neat. I've gotten some great articles in to cover that kind of thing, but it's been difficult to draw out studies in general of other religious groups, other racial groups. And I reach out to folks to work on that. And sometimes I'm successful. Generally, I'm not, for whatever reason. I would say that for Asian Americans, of course, most of that migration came over the seas to the West Coast and didn't really happen until we got into the 1860s. And there was so much, well, first of all, we had the gold rush, which did draw a lot of Asian immigrants. And then we had building of the railroads and so on. And lots of folks came overland from the Far East to be basically laborers, but they didn't travel the trails a great deal, except as those trails coincided with where they needed to work. And there hasn't been a whole lot of exploration of that. I would like to see more, is what I would say. For a period of time, 3 years, I was editor of the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Association's journal called We Proceeded On. And it was very similar to what I do with Overland Journal. I was recruiting articles and publishing a quarterly. And it was a very academic quarterly. And the membership in that organization, of course, is really interested in the 26 to 30 folks that were on that particular exploration right after the turn of the 19th century in 1804 to 1806. And I would say most of the articles are really celebratory of what a wonderful thing it was to do this exploration and what they saw as they came across. And the journals aren't exclusively from Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, but those are the two journals that are most referred to. And I received a submission from a professor in Berkeley who had studied the journals closely and saw a relationship between Meriwether Lewis and William Clark that he thought exhibited an intimacy that perhaps went beyond just their friendship. Mm-hmm. And it was very speculative. And of course, when you get an article like that you think, oh, this could stir some feathers, especially from those in the Lewis and Clark organization, some of whom were descendants of William Clark, that it might not rub them the right way. Mm-hmm. But I submitted it to a couple of other historians who read it and peer reviewed it, and they thought it was interesting and explored a new approach. And so I published it, and I got a lot of pushback from the membership for having challenged, I would say, the heterosexuality mm-hmm. of the two leaders of that exploration. And it resulted in some very harsh words and anger and pushback to the author and to the journal for having published it. But I'm a firm believer in both free press and exploring new angles of history. So I felt pretty confident in what we had done. They did threaten to have some demonstrations at the next conference that we had. And I won't say they wanted to hang me in effigy, but they did want me. They wanted me fired. Didn't happen. And it continued on. And I was able to go to that convention and smooth the waters, I think, with a number of people who were upset. I don't think anybody's published anything like that since, but it all comes around in time. And we're looking at things in a broader perspective today than folks did in the 19th century and 20th century as well. And so it's good to dig into areas that are controversial and force us to think outside the box.
I feel like that's definitely been one of the biggest obstacles in, trying to dive deeper into the various histories of these trails, is that, a lot of the institutions that have cropped up around them, look like the historical societies, don't really involve a lot of people of color. So then when you're telling the story, you're either telling somebody else's story, not from your own perspective, or you're just ignoring those stories completely. So I definitely think that we probably still have yet to figure out how to really get everybody involved, but I feel like steps are being made, like positive steps are being made, definitely.
There's a professor at Yale named Ned Blackhawk, mm-hmm. He's done some interesting explorations of Western history from a Native American perspective, which is pioneering, not to coin a phrase there, mm-hmm. but we need more folks like that doing that kind of work, and there just aren't enough of them yet.
I just am always really struck by how much of this history involves storytelling or depends on the storytelling of historians, like our contemporary historians in modern day, but then also the storytelling of the people who were keeping journals and diaries and holding on to letters. And as an editor for the journal, I wonder what your perspective is on the role that storytelling has in keeping this history.
Well, it's huge. And although we don't we do not accept articles that are based on creative writing, mm-hmm. Nor do we often review books novels and such on the trail, although that's changed in the last few years. The hard thing for me to work with is so many writers, they're not writers. They don't have good storytelling skills, nor do we, I think, in today's world, develop storytelling as a craft to the extent that we might. Anyway, I think it was much more prevalent in years past. And so a lot of the articles that I receive are pedantic. They're very pedestrian in the way that the stories are related. And I wish there was more creativity in how those stories are presented. I know in the academy at universities now, storytelling, narrative history is not held up as something that should be necessarily pursued or lauded. And I think that's a shame. I hope that the pendulum swings on that and comes back around, because when we look at other cultures that have an emphasis on oral history and the maintenance of our cultural history and stories, they know how to weave an account and open an account with strength and with a message based on the metaphor and the story. And I'd love to see much more of that appear. It's difficult with a historical journal to get that out, especially when you look at other true history journals, academic journals. There is not too much storytelling going on these days.
And it also, I think, kind of highlights the importance of looking at who is doing the storytelling, because like you were saying, different cultures have different types of storytelling. And when you look at history from solely a white Western perspective, you're looking for storytelling methods that are prevalent in those cultures, like writing letters, keeping diaries, things like that in English. And I wonder, maybe the history of these trails has been kind of centered around the white Western experience so much, because historians haven't really generally been looking for things like oral histories that may have been shared between Indigenous American groups, or diaries and journals kept in other languages like Chinese from the Chinese immigrants during the gold rush. And I definitely think, last summer I did some work trying to go through California state archives looking for stories from Chinese American history. And there's so much that is there, but not translated. And so since I'm not a fluent Chinese Mandarin speaker myself, I wasn't able to really kind of go through everything to the extent that I was hoping. But like we were saying, I think it's getting better. I think there's more attention being focused on these kinds of things, more resources going toward just kind of making these histories more accessible for everybody.
There are so many stories, and finding stories about individuals that haven't been told before. I've just received a new article on two different immigrant parties that ended up in kind of the same place in Oregon. One of the immigrant trails was peopled by family members and friends of John Brown, the abolitionist who attacked Harper's Ferry prior to the Civil War and then was hanged as a result. Anyway, his family couldn't get along with their neighbors in Iowa, and so they took off and they went to Oregon. A few years prior to that, another family had come west to Oregon, and that family had members who had been killed by John Brown and his son.
Wow.
In Kansas during the Bleeding Kansas era of the 1850s. And they get to Oregon and they're in proximity to one another. Okay, how do they deal with one another? How does this separation of North and South and slaveholders and non-slaveholders and abolitionists, how do they come together and live in proximity? It's not too far afield from what we're experiencing today with the separations of red and blue states and conservative and liberals and the animosities and angers and the lack of communication. We can learn from that. So a nice new article, a nice new way to look at things. One other thing I've been thinking about, principally because of your reaching out to me, a lot of our articles are based on documentary sources. They're based on the journals that people, I mean, there are hundreds, literally thousands of them available. I think that examining those journals for keywords that show various emotions, be it anger, weariness, joy, any of these emotional aspects of trail travel, how do they show up in the diaries and how often? And how did people react emotionally to moving across the country? Because it was a draining, emotional journey to make. And that's something that really hasn't been dug into very deeply, rather than just saying, well, we went from point 1 to point 2 and it was this many miles and these were the challenges physically to doing that. How did we feel about that? So maybe there's some articles there that can be developed. As editor of the journal, I am kind of a servant to the whimsy of the membership of our organization and to others outside of the organization who are doing research on the West in one way or another and submit articles. It's hard for me to guide the research unless I was a professor with grad students that I could direct. I have so little control over that. So I get a lot of articles that cover some of the same ground that's been covered in previous issues over the last 40 years, but hopefully from new angles with new perspectives. And I keep watching for them.
The Oregon-California Trails Association is the nation's largest and most influential organization dedicated to the preservation and protection of overland immigrant trails and the immigrant experience. Our mission at OCTA is to protect the historic immigrant trails legacy by promoting research, education, preservation activities, and public awareness of the trails, and to work with others to promote these causes. Thank you so much for tuning into our podcast. If you're interested in volunteering, becoming a member, or just learning more about the Oregon-California Trails Association, please visit our website at www.octa-trails.org. You can also find us on Facebook and YouTube at Oregon-California Trails Association and on Twitter and Instagram at OCTA_1836.